Hey, how we doing out there, guys? So, obviously, just dropped the video of talking about swarm tactics. So, I thought I'd kind of in continuing on with this, kind of make a video talking about kind of real life tactics applied to that. So, like I said, I've been on like kind of a really long kick of like watching like gun cam footage from like the Luftwaffe attacking American daylight bombers during World War II, and just kind of in general, just kind of been interested in that. And honestly, I don't really know why. I've never been as much of a like an aviation guy as I have been, a ground related person, if that's the way to say that, I guess. But I think one thing I was kind of struck by is that I've read some personal accounts and things like that, and is just that the same is true of like tank commanders or snipers or some special missions units or very effective fighter pilots, is that you're talking about at kind of the end of the day, you're dealing with like people who have much more of a choice to kind of engage or not engage, the level of commitment that they have. And some of these people are just absolute apex predators. And I respect that. Because, and again, politics aside or anything on that, there's a quote I heard, not heard, well, I read it from a German pilot in World War II. And I'm going to paraphrase it, otherwise I'll butcher it. But he said something to the effect of, you get in a turning fight with some Spitfires, and it's very exciting. Maybe even you'd call it fun. The first time you curve in on a formation of fortresses, all of your past sins flash before your eyes. And so, just kind of, it's like the guys that have to fly into a 1,000 bomber formation in a single engine fighter and and deal with it in World War II is like, you've got to respect that motivation on there. So, in kind of keeping with swarm tactics, I actually think that that's a very good example of what swarm tactics can do, or how they can be used, and they can be effective. And obviously, we could have talked about whether the Luftwaffe like actually was or was not effective in World War II, and that's a very deep conversation that other people have had on the internet. And if you asked me, I would try to find their video and send it to you. But what I think is very interesting with it is because when you're talking about these formations of bombers, you're talking about very large planes that are very difficult to bring down by enemy fighters for most of the war, just given the nature of the armament that fighters can carry while still retaining their qualities as a dogfighter. So, for example, if you're a standard like BF 109, like G model, you've got a couple of machine guns that sit right in front of you, and they fire through the propeller. You've got a 20 millimeter cannon that flies through the middle, like basically out the engine cowling, through the middle of the propeller, and then maybe you have a machine gun or one or a cannon in each wing. But the more stuff that you add to it, the less nimble it becomes. So you're talking about basically having, so they had like the MG 131, so they had basically a 13 millimeter, so kind of their version of the 50 cal, and then a 20 millimeter cannon, and having to kind of slice in and try to attack some of these bombers. Which is just it's not a lot of firepower. Because obviously they were it's primarily designed to deal with other enemy fighters. So they start having additional models, that are now carrying multiple, like 4 to 6, MG 151 20 millimeter cannons, or multiple Mark 108 30 Mike cannons. Some of their larger two engine, ME 110s and like ME 410s are carrying 50 millimeter, or 37 millimeter and 50 millimeter cannons and stuff like that. So so in a way, what I kind of thought was actually, a very good way to compare it is kind of to like what wolves do. And I think it's actually almost a very, very pure representation of that. So kind of a little bit of a background, we'll kind of talk a little bit about, some of the basics of the, of the bombers and how the Luftwaffe is attacking them. And then we'll kind of, have a couple of like, short videos that we can kind of watch and we can kind of talk a little bit more about that. So, so early on in the war, when the Allies, so the Americans are conducting the daylight bombing campaign, but so in conjunction with British fighters and things like that. So early on in the war, when the fighter cover was not able to go all the way to the target and back with the bombers, what the tactic tended to be would be that so the Germans kind of had a couple of designations. So they had what were called like Jagdgeschwader, which are basically fighter squadrons, or hunting squadrons, and then they had Zerstörgeschwader, which are destroyer squadrons. So the Me-110s, the Me-410s, and stuff were the destroyers. Basically, they're planes that are not maneuverable enough to deal with dogfighting other enemy fighters, but because they're larger platforms, multiple crew members, multiple engines, they can carry more and heavier armament. So kind of and then they can also be more armored to resist the defensive fire of the bombers. So the idea was kind of that the Me-109s, the FW-190s, so the fighters, the Jagdgeschwader of the German Luftwaffe would go and deal with American fighters, drive them off, or things like that, or then they'd kind of wait until they got past the range of the escorting fighters. Then the destroyers would come in, and the destroyers would primarily attack kind of standard rear attack positions. So they could stay on what we'd call like on target longer, so they could deliver more firepower. But obviously the Americans countered with different formations, and the B-17 kind of famously had like between 10 and like 15 50 caliber machine guns, kind of depending on the model and things like that, to provide defensive firepower. So obviously the 50 cals carried by the bombers were a deterrent, and I want to make sure I state this clearly. Is so if you're the gunners, and the purpose of the guns on the bomber is definitely to damage or destroy German fighter planes if possible. But one of the primary ways that these machine guns kind of fill their role is that they make it dangerous to attack the bombers in the way that is the easiest to be successful. So the classic ways to attack enemy aircraft, for pilots, is typically either from above or below and then behind. And the reason for that is kind of obvious. If you're looking at a bomber, if you are directly in line with it, looking at it, it is a very small target. Any deviation up or down or left or right, and now you're not going to hit any significant parts of the plane. So by going below it or above it and then angling down slightly, now the bomber becomes massively wider, longer, has a larger breadth, and now you have access to the parts of it that are the most damaging. Another very popular way to attack it, the Japanese like to attack from straight down. So obviously, if you're attacking straight down or straight up, the plane is the largest target available. So it's, relatively speaking, it's the easiest to hit at that. So if you think about how the machine guns are set up defensively, is while yes, they are trying to damage and destroy enemy fighters for certain, is being arranged the way that they are. So having tail gunners, having a top turret and a ball turret on the bottom, is the standard ways of attacking from behind are just more dangerous. Now that's one of the reasons why the destroyer squadrons, is the Zerstörers, are attacking, is that they're more heavily armored, and also having more cannons, they can attack from a little bit of a standoff distance on some of that. And a very common tactic that the successful destroyer pilots talked about is that they would basically fly in, they would use their machine guns and kill the tail gunner first, and then they could creep very close and deliver incredibly devastating attacks to the bombers. So that's kind of the basics of it. But as fighter escorts got better, they got the range increased and things like that, then they started to drive the destroyer squadrons from the sky. They're just losing too many Me-110s, Me-410s, things like that. And so then it became kind of more and more up to the single engine fighters to be able to handle that. So they did start to put more armament on some of the planes. So like famously the Focke-Wulf FW-190A8, the A8, it was called the Sturmbaka. So it was basically designed 100% to deal with the heavy bombers. It had 30 millimeter Mark 108 cannons. It had armored windscreen, things like that. It was meant for that. But it basically loses much of its characteristics as being a dogfighter, which means that now it is vulnerable to enemy fighters at the time. So some of the ways that the Germans kind of started to deal with this would be things like head-on attacks became more popular. So the head-on attack, which was, so obviously you're coming directly at an enemy. So was typically done from the way the Germans suggested it that was most effective was to not come directly straight on, though to be off at an angle of like 10 to 50 degrees, and then if possible slightly above or slightly below. So again, if you think about that, that makes the target slightly wider, slightly longer, have slightly larger breadth, so there's more of it to hit. So the advantages of the head-on attack are that you close so quickly with the target that it basically does not have much chance, much time to get the defensive armament aimed at you, and then you can peel off either down or up, and so you can use your speed to kind of escape away. Now, what that also means is that you, as a pilot attacking that, also only have about 1.5 seconds to actually attack. So you can only actually fire a limited number of rounds. So however many machine guns or cannons that you have, their rate of fire, in rounds per minute, divide that by 60, take all that, and then times it by 1.5 seconds, and that's the number of rounds that you can get off. And it's not very many. And so that became an effective method. Other methods or other kind of, like criteria with that is that the most successful German pilots and squadrons, what they talked about is of keeping a very high cohesion and a very tightly packed. So the standard German element was a four-plane element called a Schwarm, which also I think kind of makes this a good example. And then of keeping a very tight formation so that the more experienced guys, the braver guys, the more, like I said, the guys who are more of the more refined predators can drive the elements or drive the swarm, drive the squadron closer to the bomber formation before instigating their attack, so they'll have a better chance of actually scoring hits. And kind of account for the fact that newer pilots would tend to shoot from too far out, break off too soon, not close in enough where they could be more effective. And then also just there's issues of kind of timidness or lack of courage on some of those things. And again, I cannot possibly in my brain imagine what it feels like to be in a tiny BF-109G and then fly in a formation of hundreds of four-engine bombers, 25,000. I mean, that's trying to imagine that is just terrifying. So keeping those tight formations. The other thing that it allowed it to do, and this is a very key component of kind of the swarm tactic, is it allowed the element commanders, the squadron commanders, to concentrate their efforts on a smaller number of bombers to try to get a greater effect. So obviously the most effective way to bring down an individual bomber is to attack it with multiple planes, to concentrate fire and things like that. Now, conversely, the best way to hit numerous planes would be to kind of everybody like, hey, here's a designated target. But again, so we're talking about having firepower related issues, not being able to cause enough damage because the limitation of the weapons and the limitation of the time to actually fire rounds and successfully hit a target. So the best way to be successful would be to direct your swarm, your element or your squadron at one particular flight, and then have all the planes or multiple planes direct their fire at like a single bomber. So obviously if they're doing a head-on attack, they're going to pass that bomber very quickly. Then they either need to, when they peel off, or they either need to like now select an additional bomber behind it and direct their fire onto that to be more effective. So now the reason why I kind of pulled up my my wolf hunting video here is because it kind of struck me that the things that made the Luftwaffe anti-bomber campaign successful at times are the exact same things that make wolf packs hunting very successful. And I thought it was a very interesting thing to kind of think of in terms of so like compare the fighters to the wolves, right? So the idea is you're attacking a formation that is larger than you, it's more powerful than you, has more guns than you. They'll definitely kill you if you get too close, you stay around for too long. You can't get in some sort of sustained engagement with them whatsoever. So what do? So if you're the fighters, you want to hit, wound, damage bombers, get them to slow down or to mess with their general flight characteristics. Now, once that bomber slows down or falls out of formation, now he can be jumped on relatively safely, because now that he's by himself, he no longer has the protective guns of the rest of his squadron, the rest of his flight and everything like that to help him out. And now you can use your plane much more effectively. So I thought this is kind of an interesting, video, because I've got this, and then we can kind of, flash forward here and compare it to, kind of a video of attacking bombers here. So we got some
The herd,
wolves doing
waiting
wolf
for an
things.
old, or sick, or just unlucky elk to make a wrong move. The alpha male leads the hunt. He bides his time, directing his troops. And eventually, one elk stumbles. The hungry wolves quickly surround the faltering victim.
So I thought that was interesting because, in this particular case, like, the animal wasn't wounded or sick or anything like that. It basically just, it got tired, basically fell itself out of formation. And now one of the wolves basically latches on. A single wolf is not going to be able to probably kill that thing by itself. He can slow it down. He can wound it. All the other wolves come and pounce on it. Very comparable to successful counter bombing usage. So, again, so kind of, show some clips here of German fighters attacking bombers. So you'll see a little bit of them attacking in formation, but a lot of what you see, and it needs to be said with the gun camera footage from the German military, it was actually almost the entirety of all their gun cam footage was destroyed in the fire from the terror bombing of Dresden. So there's very, very limited amount of it that's actually left. But what you tend to see in most of the videos where you see single-engine fighters closing in and knocking bombers out with significant sustained attacks, it's a bomber that's by itself. So it's been knocked out of formation in some manner. So we'll kind of... So you can see even with an attack from the rear, how quickly the fighters actually close in on it and have to break their attacks off. There's a couple of frontal attacks coming up here. And so again, all lone bombers. They can be pounced upon, by themselves out there. That one you can actually see he shoots his wingman who's in front of him and attacking the same bomber. Doesn't appear to shoot him down, but he definitely hits him. But here we've got head-on attacks. Look how fast the closing speed is on the head-on attack. So he gets basically 2 bursts essentially, and then that's basically the entirety of the time there. So I thought that, kind of, interesting, in talking swarm tactics on that. So we can kind of talk a little bit about, like the counter swarm tactics and the things that the Americans basically tried to do to counter that. So what they used is what's called the combat box. The combat box is a little bit of a blanket term. But so basically what you have here, so if we use this would be a side view. So what you have is you have a leading element here. So the leading element is flying level. So then they basically have what they call like the high, the low, and the low. So a 12 plane squadron or group, I forget, and then it's like a 36 plane group basically. So if you look, essentially what you have here is you essentially have planes that are echeloned out to the side and then from high to low. So the idea being that, if you're a fighter, as you fly through this, you have the guns, and so this group would be here, and then it would have an additional group that would be over here. There would be another group that's over here, so on and so forth, and then it would have a lot of depth, i.e. going straight back, behind this. So the idea being that you have the maximum number of guns concentrated to be as much of a deterrent and as much of a potential threat as possible. So here's kind of a couple pictures of it in action. So again, here's a large formation of B-17. So what you see is, so you have the elements, so they're very fanned out, both. So you look at how the altitude differences of these. I mean, you're talking like that's thousands of feet difference, from up here to down here. And then you look at how much breadth this covers, going across, and then also how much depth. So It helps concentrate the firepower, of the bombers. It's also, you can see exactly why bombers never were particularly accurate, because basically all of these are going to drop their bombs at similar times, and so they're they're only going to hit a certain an area. And then here's a very clear picture of this is actually the attack on Ploiesti. I don't know if this was Operation Tidal Wave or not, the kind of the famous one, but you can see how much difference there is in altitude, and then also how much difference there is in breadth and depth here. So now this required a lot of coordination from the bombers, because obviously you need to be in the right position so that you don't fly, into the bombs of someone who's above you, and also, you don't want to get close enough that there's the risk of, of collisions and things like that. You want to be far enough that you have the ability to shoot safely. Because the other thing you have to be careful of is, obviously, if you're this plane, multiple guns of yours would be able to hit this plane if you were not being particularly disciplined. With your defensive fire. So that's something to keep in mind. So the swarm tactics, again, I think very good example of like kind of what the Luftwaffe's general idea was with that, and you can kind of see that a little bit in their choice of armament. So one, they started to go to more and more cannons, where you see like the Americans did not. They basically kept the 50 cal throughout, and even into the Korean War. And then you look at kind of the other things that they did. So they started carrying basically underwing rockets, and then they started carrying bombs. And so they would either get behind this formation, they would shoot the rocket, and it basically had a timed fuse on it. So they would they would try to get to a certain distance, shoot these rockets into the middle of formation. They would blow up large fragmentation. The idea being, obviously, to damage bombers and to push some of them out of formation. It would be the same thing. They would fly above them and drop these anti-air, basically like air-to-air bombs, to blow up in the middle of the formation. And the goal was again to try to drive some of the individual bombers to lose their cohesion. If you could damage one and get it to fall behind, or if you could just get one group to get too far away from a group, and then you could vector planes in on it to be able to attack it successfully. But I think that's again a good example, because the other part of the swarm tactic is that you're overwhelming a target by, so the target in this case, they are trying to basically, that's why, I use the wolf example. So the wolves are attacking as multiple individual elements, but are coordinated in on one target, whereas you see the prey, so the elk in that case, as long as they stay tightly packed, cohesive, there's not really anyone for the wolves to attack. So one of the ways they get around is they get them moving to make them tired, but they're also attacking from all sorts of different sides. And you see, some of the wolves are running, they're in and amongst them and other things like that. So what that does is it breaks down the cohesion. It makes individual animals, or in that case, individual airplanes, feel overwhelmed and lose discipline, lose cohesion. And all that you need is for a plane to, a plane, especially if you think about being like the leading element. So if you're the lead plane in a lead element, and you move over here, your other planes are going to stay with you, because that's their orientation. But if you lead them out of the protective fires of the rest of the herd, basically, now they're much more susceptible to fighters, or if they're flying low, even to flak units and stuff like that. So again, kind of talking swarm tactics. I think that the counter bomber stuff and just some of the general fighter related things are very very good examples. And like I said, I think the other part of it that makes it a good example is, kind of I mentioned in the, using my whiteboard video, is that I find these particular types of things very interesting, because yes, there's definitely a discipline, a unit cohesion, coordination component. There absolutely is. But kind of when you get to the sharp tip of this, what you have is basically like individual men who themselves are predators, and they are choosing to make this attack, to push it home, to push in, taking the danger, and to try to press it home and make it work. And I think that's, when you talk about the swarm stuff, that's another thing that's very relevant with it, is what makes some of the irregular things very effective is if you do have motivated groups of people, motivated commanders and things like that, that will press the attack and will make this work. You can very much compound the compound the terror, compound the effect of just having multiple elements out there that are all separate but working towards the same target, the same goal. That's separate from kind of the more kind of cohesive or more, maybe like regimented, more, kind of stiffly organized kind of elements. But that's all I've got on this, guys. But remember, guys, only the hits count, and you can never miss fast enough to catch back up.